Put your sound on.
The guy who shears the sheep, gets the sheep, the wool. Here, the husband gets those dividends. So, if, for example, she owns a farm, an orchard, he would get the oranges, but she would get the farm back, whether it went up in value or then down in value. She would get the farm back in the event of his death or their divorce. There's a second category of stuff called Son Barzel. Son Barzel literally means iron sheep. That means you can't shear it, but that it has a fixed value. Now, there's a big machlaikas on exactly how something becomes Son Barzel. We will take for our discussion the following definition. It is property that she brings to the marriage to induce her husband to marry her. And it's listed in the Kesuba that she gets it back if he dies and they pay the Kesuba. So instead, in addition to the 200 zuz or $20 million, whatever is negotiated today, we have a fixed Kesuba. Then it was negotiated with each family. This is her dowry she brings to the marriage, and it gets appraised. There were one Kohen and other people would appraise the property and stipulate a value. Now, if it goes up in value, the husband gets that gain. All she gets back is the physical piece of property, whatever it's now worth, or the cash value at the moment of the marriage. So in a certain sense, since the husband suffers the loss, he has to put up, if it's a gold bar, and in the Kesuba it says one ounce gold bar. So if it's worth $1,800 and it goes down to 15, the husband has to give her the gold bar plus the $300 that it went down in value. If it went up in value, the husband can shave off some gold, or he can sell it and give her the $1,800 it was worth. So in that sense, Son Barzel is more protected on the one hand. No matter what happens, she gets her money back. On the other hand, he has a greater incidence of ownership because he benefits not only from the dividends or produce, but also from any appreciation or suffers any loss. Now, the one caveat to that would be, what if it's Bubby great-great-great-great-grandmother's treasured porcelain? So according to one sheet, at least, she can demand that back. The only way she wouldn't get it back is if it was broken, and then he has to compensate her. But the other sheet is no, he can even sell it as long as he puts the money in escrow, so she's protected to get her money back. So we have Son Barzel and Nichse Son Barzel and Nichse Maluk. Now, what happens if the possessions happen to be slaves? That's what the Mishnah is going to talk about. And what the Mishnah is going to tell us is that since she has the gain, like if she has a 5-year-old slave, he's not worth very much. But if they're married 10 years and now he's 15 years old, he's in the prime of his life and he's worth quite a bit more, she gets the value of the slave. He's her slave. It's just that he can work for her husband, but she owns the slave. So the pendulum swings with Nichse Malug to it's more hers than his. Meanwhile, if it was Nichse Tzon Barzel, if the 5-year-old grew up to 15, the husband gains the benefit. The pendulum swings with Nichse Tzon Barzel, even though it's better protected because it's in the Kasuba, the pendulum swings to, in a sense, it's more his. So with that background, we can understand the Mishnah. Now, again, we had today's Parsha. There are women who are not allowed to marry a Kohen. If they do, it is a valid marriage, but she does not get the Truma. We learned all this several times before. So now what about her slaves? Okay, Almana LaKohen Gadol. If a Kohen Gadol marries a widow, he's not allowed to do that, but the marriage is a valid marriage. Gerusha Chalutza LaKohen Hedyad, or a Stam Kohen marries a Gerusha or a Chalutza. Hichnisa lo avdei malug, the avdei tzon barzel, and she brings to the marriage a bunch of slaves in both categories, 5 here and 5 there, say, avdei malug lo yeachlu b'truma. Just as she cannot eat truma, the slaves that are more hers, by the way I described it, may not eat truma. Okay? Avdei tzon barzel yochelu. But the tzon barzel slaves that are sort of more his can eat truma. The avdehen avdei elohen avdei malug. How do we define which kind of slave they are if they're avdei malug? Im meso lo. The slave dies, tough noogies on her. She suffers the loss. The im husiru, if they become more valuable, husiru la. She benefits from their appreciation and value. Afal pi shehu chayev mizonosan. Even though the husband has a legal obligation to feed, clothe, and house those slaves, nonetheless, they can't eat truma. Hare elu lo yachol b'truma. He has to isolate the truma from them, and they cannot partake in truma foods. The iluhen of tzon barzel. This is the category of slaves that would be tzon barzel slaves. Im meso lo. If they die, the husband loses. He suffers the loss. He doesn't have the use of that slave anymore or the value of that slave. The
wife
what?
He has to give back the money to the wife.
If she's tzon barzel, he just has to pay the initial appraised value of that slave. The im hasiru, if that slave goes up in value, hasiru loy. He gets the benefit. In my example, she gets the cash value of a 5-year-old Eved, and the husband can sell that slave and get all the extra money that a 15-year-old slave is worth. Okay, hoil v'hu chayev ba'acha riyuson. And the reason that it's considered more his is he has an achrayus. In other words, he suffers the loss, he benefits from the gain. Hare elu yochlu b'truma. Therefore, they are permitted to eat truma, the tzon barzel slaves. That's if it's a forbidden marriage to a kohen and she can't eat truma. So this is what happens with the sets of slaves. Pardon me? The tzon barzel slaves can eat truma. The mikse malug cannot, and she cannot, because she's a halala if they have sex even once. Now, there was a shita we learned earlier that prior to them having sex even once, she may, according to one shita, eat truma because she didn't do anything wrong yet. According to the other shita, she's preparing to do something wrong. She bought a fancy nightgown and makeup for the wedding night, so she cannot. Okay. Bas Yisrael Shanisas Lakohen. What about Stam, a regular girl, and she marries a Kohen? The Hichnisa Lo Avadim, and she brings slaves to the table, right? Ben of the Malug, Ben of the Tzayin Barzel. Well, it doesn't matter what kind of slaves they are. Hare Elu Yachlu B'Truma. They can eat truma because she can eat truma, and however you label them, they are to some extent hers and her property. And as her property, they can also eat truma because they're his property. We'll learn that in the Gemara. That if she buys, even during the marriage, if she buys a slave, since she, quote, belongs, unquote, to him, her slave indirectly belongs to him and can eat truma. Okay, now what about the daughter of a Kohen who marries a Yisrael or a Levi? If she lives with her father, she's still in Arusa, she can eat truma. As soon as she's in a sewer, she moves in with her husband. She's not a Kohenis anymore from the standpoint of eating truma. If she dies child, if he dies and she has not born a child, she can return to her father's house and eat truma. So what happens with the slaves? When she was in her father's house, her slaves were part of her father's household, they could eat truma. But when she moved in with her husband, they could no longer eat truma. What's the deal when she goes back to Tati, if she does?
The slaves weren't hers.
What they were.
They were her personal.
Yeah. She had her great grandmother gave her a diamond brooch. She didn't like making up her bed on her own, so she went on and bought a shifcha. Or her father gave her a shifcha. Woman can own property. Okay, this isn't in our Gemara, but even to the extent, if your wife, Bob, makes a living, has a job, halachically, her income belongs to you because you're obligated to support her. But she could go to Bezdin. I mean, this is halacha l'maisa even today. She could go to Bezdin and say, I make more than Bob does. I don't want him to support me. I'll pay my own bills. I'll pay the mortgage. I'll buy the food. Then you have no longer any control over her money. Women do have property rights and income rights. And in many regards, the Jewish system, although it's thousands of years old, was far more liberal than other systems. All right. So anyway, Bas Kohen Shanisas Yisrael, a Jewish girl marries a normal guy. V'hiknisa lo avadim, and brings her slaves with her into the marriage. Ben avdei melug, ben avdei tzon barzel. Doesn't matter what kind of slaves they are. Hare elu lo yachlu b'truma. They cannot eat truma. And when she goes home to her father, because she had no children, the slaves still can't eat truma. They don't bounce back, although she might under certain circumstances. All right, Gemara. Why is all this? Avdei malug yachlu v'truma? Is it really so that nichsei malug slaves can't eat truma? Amai, why not? Lahave v'kinyano shekana kinyan. Why don't we consider this a case of his property, because he gave money and he bought, quote unquote, his wife? His property acquires property. And therefore, it's at least indirectly his. And why shouldn't they eat truma? Who cares about these differentiations? Menayan lekohen shenasa isha. How do we know that that rule of a purchaser purchasing the property belongs to the master? Isha shekana avadim, a man acquires a wife and she goes and buys slaves. Sheyachlu b'truma. Those slaves should be able to eat truma. So how do we know that? Because the pasuk involved has a double lashon. The kohen ki yikna nefesh. If a kohen acquires a person, now that could be a slave or that could be a wife. It's both a kinyan. Then the pasuk says, kinyan kaspo. It is a financial purchase. It was purchased with money. Who yachol tvo. That acquired individual may eat truma. So that's how a woman who's acquired by her husband, who's a Kohen, can eat truma. And the extra words, it says he acquires with money. The extra words indicate that anything she buys, he owns. Okay? Uminayin leisha shekon savadim. How do we know that the woman who buys slaves while they're married, avadim shekanu of them avadim, or if a slave, now this is, we don't really chop this, but slaves are people too. And they can have property. They're not barred from owning things. So let's say you're an Eved, someone's an Eved.
Doesn't all his possessions are owned by the master?
If somebody gave the slave a matana,
Right,
the condition that
that
the
is that it's
master
his.
has no right to it.
All right, or
then
the
it would belong
slave,
to him.
or the slave inherited a gold ring from his father. And he says to the Jew, I'll be glad, because the slave can refuse to be a slave. He can, if the slave refuses to go to the mikveh, or get a bris milah, the boss can't, at least according to one sheet, he has to free him.
Right.
So if the slave makes a condition, the things I own before I come to you remain mine. Or if the slave saves up his tips and buys a portfolio and he put Apple and it went up, it's his. Now the slave wants to make his life easier. You know, he's the house slave. He's doing the laundry and stuff. He could buy a slave to do it for him. So anyway, if of those shekanu avodim, a slave who acquires slaves, sheyachlu b'truma, and it's a Kohanic family, those new slaves of the slave, because of the double lashon in the pasuk, they can also eat truma. So kininu shekana kinyan eichel. So this implies that unconditionally, the acquisitions of someone who is owned by someone should be able to eat truma. And therefore, why do we differentiate between the Malug slaves and the Tzon Barzel slaves? So the Gemara introduces a general principle that will attempt to explain it all. Okay? Kola oichel meichel. Anyone who himself or herself is allowed to eat truma, either by birth or by marriage, Michael, anyone that he owns, can also eat truma. Kol she'ein eichel eino Michael. Anyone who, by virtue of some rationale why he's a Kohen but he can't eat, or some rationale why she's the wife of a Kohen but she can't eat, like the forbidden marriages, she cannot extend her eating privileges to the property unless she has eating privileges. So that's the general rule. So now the Gemara, of course, based on the way Gemara works, is going to try and knock down the general rule. V'lo, is that really work? Hare arel the kohatameyim, any Kohen who for medical reasons was not circumcised, he cannot eat truma, but his slaves can. Or a Kohen who's tameh, he went through a cemetery, whatever. He cannot eat truma until he gets spritzed with the mechatas, but his slaves can continue to eat truma. She'ein an eichlin u'meichilin. but they can't eat the Orel or the Tameh slave, but they can give the privilege of eating to their slaves. So therefore, why do we not say that the widow who's not allowed to marry the Kohen and herself cannot eat is in the same category as the Orel or the Tameh Kohen and should be able to transfer the rights even to Nichsei Malug? That's the question. So the Gemara answers, Hasam Pumaihu Ka'iv Lahu. Literally, it means his mouth hurts. He has a toothache. So you pull the tooth and the toothache's gone, or you swish some booze in your mouth and the toothache's gone. The analogy being that if they invent vitamin K so that the blood will clot, that Kohen could now get a bris. It's not a permanent condition, at least theoretically. The Kohen who's Tameh, if we found the para aduma, we could spritz him and he could go out of his status of tuma. So the reason they can pass on the rights to eat truma to their slaves is because at least theoretically their status of non-eaters is only temporary. Whereas the almana, the minute she has sex with her husband, becomes a halala. You can never wipe that off. That's a permanent condition. It's not like a toothache. So the Gemara challenges, but there are Kahanim who have permanent disqualifications. Hare mamzer, she ain't eichel v'meichel. What about if a Kohen has an illicit child who's halachically a mamzer, but he lives in the household of the father and he owns slaves? Those slaves are household slaves and they can eat truma. So there you have a breach to this. If you can, they can rule. Omer Ravina, Kinyan Eichel Ka'omar. You have to add a word to the brisa. Kinyan Eichel Michael. Someone who is acquired who can eat transfers eating. She'enu Eichel, if the person who acquires can't eat, Einu Meichel, then he cannot entirely other. So the widow is in that category, and therefore her Malug slaves cannot eat Truma. That was one possibility. The second possibility is this whole business of halal is midrabanan. In other words, midiaraisa, the rule does apply. The illicit wife cannot eat truma, but her slaves can without distinction, midiaraisa. And the Rabbanan came along and made a gezerah, they can't. So we are going to present that, and then we're going to ask, why did they make that gezerah? Ravina Aimer, midiraisa Michael Achle. From a Torah level, they can certainly eat truma, all the slaves. V'Rabbanan hu de gazrei bahu, and it's the rabbis that made a gezerah they can't. Kidei shetomer ani eini eicheles, the woman will say, I can't eat truma. Of de anan eichlin, my slaves can't eat either. So I don't have all the benefits that a marriage to a Kohen should afford me. I'm treated like I'm a paid concubine. He has to feed me, but I can't eat truma. I'm not a full-fledged wife. Zainahi etzlo. He's thinking of me as a convenient receptacle. And therefore, she won't marry him in the first place. Hilkach asi la afuka. This will cause strife between them, and the marriage won't be successful, and they'll give her the divorce that the Chachamim say he's supposed to do. So it's a gezerah so that she won't marry him in the first place, or won't stay with him if she did. That was number two. Rav Ashi Omer, another possibility. Gezerah shemer ta'achil la'achar misa. If she has children, before we talked, if she doesn't, then she goes home to her father Bas Cohen. But if she's a Bas Yisrael and she has children, and her husband dies, she may continue eating truma based on the fact that her children can eat truma. She gets that loophole, but her slaves do not. So she would make the mistake of saying, now I can eat truma. I couldn't eat truma when I was married to Schwartz, to Mr. Cohen, because I was a halal. But now, because my kids, they can eat. So we make that gezerah that they can never eat truma lest she inadvertently feed them truma after the husband's death. Elamiyata, but if you're going to say that, Bas Yisrael Shanisus Lekohen Lo Tachil. So if that gezerah is the rationale, then I'm sorry, in the previous case, I'll go home to my father, I can eat, I didn't have children. So my slaves should be able to go with me and eat there. And no, that's not the case. So, but if that's the steal, if it's a gezerah for that reason, Bas Yisrael Shanisus Lekohen Lo Tachil. Even the non-Kohen wife, she might err and feed her slaves. Gezerah shemitach alachem. So we make the gezerah for her too. But the Mishnah said they can eat. So what's going on? That's not a good enough reason. We've shown it doesn't work. Ella Omer Ravashi. So Ravashi explains yet a fourth reason. The Almana Kohenes. What about the daughter of a Kohen or the widow of a Kohen who marries the Kohen Gadol? The Asya Aruye. She might make the following argument. Me ikara achle betruma de benasa. After my first husband died and I was simply a widow, but my father was a Kohen and I had no children, I can go home to my father. I could take my slaves with me and they would be able to eat there. That's what she thinks. Va'an avi inasvele lahai achle betruma de gavrai. And then I married the Kohen Gadol. And because of my disqualification, my slaves could no longer eat. But now that the Kohen Gadol died, Hashta Hareli Lemilse Kamaisa. Maybe I return to the status quo ante of being the daughter of a Kohen. I can eat and they can eat. Lo yada dami ikara lo shavisa lenafshe chalala. She does not realize that her state as a halala disqualifies her for all eternity, no matter who dies and who she moves in with. So therefore, we do not let her slaves eat now, lest you make the error of them eating under those unfortunate circumstances. Hashta shavisa lenafshe chalala. Now, when I was the Kohen Gadol's wife, I was a halala, but I'm not anymore. And since she can't, that's an error on her part, since she's always a halala and never can eat truma again, so too her slaves will not be able to eat truma later, and therefore we make a gezerah they can't eat now either if they're nichsei maluk. So tanich la almana lekahenes. That applies to the daughter of a Kohen who's a widow and she marries the Kohen Gadol. Almana Bas Yisrael Ma'ikal Meimar. What about the widow who's the daughter of a regular guy? She would not want to feed her slaves truma later. She knows she's out and they're out. So why would they make this gezerah? We're making this gezerah for the very unusual case of a daughter of a Kohen illegally marrying the Kohen. But that's not a normal case. More often, they marry regular widows or regular women, and we make this gezerah. It's much too broad. It's for a very narrow case, and you're banning all slaves from truma. The almanusa lo plige rabbanan. The rabbis don't distinguish a widow's a widow, and they made this low plug gezerah. We have cases like that elsewhere also. Okay, so now Itmar, we have a memra, a brisa. Hamachneses shum labaila. A woman brings a praised property. That means its own barzel to the marriage. Okay? Hiomeres keli ani noteles. He divorces her. She says, I want my great-great-grandmother's dishes back. They're a family heirloom. Vahu omer domimani. He says, look at the kasuba. The kasuba says they're worth $1,000. Here's $1,000. Get out of my house. Here, I met my own barzel obligation. I paid you the value. No, and that's okay. Hadin me. So who do we paskin like? Does she have the right, since it's own barzel and it's listed in the kasuba, to claim the actual object? Or does he have the right to say, no, all I am obligated to give you is the stipulated value? So, of course, it's a machlaitis. Reb Yehuda Aimer Hadinima. The halal, according to Reb Yehuda, she's the wins that bezdin. She gets the dishes. Rav Ami Aimer Hadinima. No, he keeps the dishes. He only has to give her the value. Rav Yehuda Omer Hadimima, she wins the bezdin mishum shevach beis aviha didei have, because she says this is my great grandmother's dishes. They have value to me other than their intrinsic cash value. They're my father. The lashon in the Gemara is the prestige of my father's house is what I want back. Okay, family heirlooms. Okay, V'Ravami Omer Hadinimai, that he wins that bezdin. Kevan de Omar Mar, because in our Mishnah we stipulated in Meso Lo. If they die, the slaves, the Barzel slaves, he suffers the loss. The Hosiru Lo. If they gain value, the value gain is his. So Hoil v'chayev ba'acharusan. All he yochelu, and it was only because those slaves, he has this stronger incidence of ownership that they could eat. So by analogizing, he has a strong, even though it's as if she has a lien on that dish for $1,000. But for all intents and purposes, it's his dish, but it has a lien on it. So he has the choice of giving her the dish or closing out the lien by making the payment. So we have to see, like, who's the, okay, so where am I? Okay. So Omar of Safra, Mi Katani Vehain Shalom. What did the Mishnah say at the end? That the Tzon Barzel slaves may eat truma because he owns them? It didn't say that. Okay? Hoel v'chayav ba'achur yusan kantani. It says because he has all the obligations, the liabilities, they can eat. It's only an incident of ownership. But he doesn't really have title to them. Literally, he does not really own them. Okay? So now, is it really true that if you have all the liabilities and benefits of ownership, they can eat truma even though they do not have title. Is that a reality? We're going to say maybe it's not. V'hatanan, we have a Mishnah in Truma. Yisrael shesachru para mikayhen. Mr. Schwartz rents a cow from Mr. Cohen. Hareze ya'achilenaha mereshine truma. The Yisrael who rented the cow can walk down the road to the Kohen's farm and take truma straw from the Kohen and feed it to the cow, because the cow belongs to the Kohen, even though it's in the Israel's possession. That's not the part that's important to us. Kohen shesacha param Yisrael, but a Kohen who rents the cow from the Jew, from the regular Jew, even though the Kohen has all the obligations of feeding and caring for and housing and treating nicely that cow, lo ya'achilena karshine truma, he may not feed that cow truma because it's not his. So he has all the responsibilities as if he were the owner. If the cow dies, he has to pay the Israel. If the cow gets hurt, he has to pay the Israel the difference in value. But he doesn't, but being responsible for it isn't enough. The tistavra hinami mechayve began v'adveda. Wait a minute. He's only got certain obligations. If it disappears or if it's stolen, he has to pay. Okay? But if there's a flood and the cow drowns or it's struck by lightning and dies, then he doesn't have to pay. I can't say this. If the cow becomes ill and is thus diminished in value, or the cow gets sick and it becomes lost value, does the renter have to cover the loss? No, he just returns the sick cow. So he doesn't have enough incidents of ownership that the Kohen should be able to feed it truma, and the analogy is imperfect. Okay. Halo damya elasefa. If that case is really related to the Seifa in our Mishnah, Yisrael shesam paral mikohen. If the Mishnah in Truma, it says later on, but if they went and got the animal appraised before he took it, the Israel took it from the Kohen, and the borrower says, I will return a $1,000 cow to you, or I'll make up the difference. So it would be much more analogous to Tzon Barzel. Lo ya'achilenha mekarshine truma, they still cannot feed it with truma feed now. Since he undertook a greater responsibility than the stam renter, he may not now go down the road and get truma fodder from the Kohen. Okay? Avo, Kohen, sheshum parami Israel, but in the reverse, where the Kohen has the animal evaluated and agrees to pay back the exact value no matter what happens, truma, now the Kohen can feed it. So here the slaves and the cows are analogous. The first set of cows are like Nichsei Malug, and the second set of cows are like Tzon Barzel cows. Now, Yosef Rava v'Rav Yosef b'shile Parke the Rav Nachman. Rava and Rav Yosef were sitting in on a shiur by Rav Nachman, who was talking about this inyan, about Nichsei Tzon Barzel, Nichsei Malok. The Yasvei Amre. So after the shiur, they were discussing the inyanim, and they bring outside sources. Okay, Tanya Kavasi to Reb Yehuda. One of them says, I got a brisa that backs up Reb Yehuda that she gets the dishes back. Right? The Tanya Kavasi to Reb Ami. And the other says, yeah, but I got a brisa that supports Reb Ami, that all she gets is the $1,000. Tanya Kavasi to Reb Ami brisa. Now, there's a din. If the owner of a slave damages that slave, the slave goes free. If a third party damages the slave, the owner can sue the third party for damages, but the slave does not go free. So let's try and apply this to the husband and wife. Updates on Barzel, Yoitzin, B'Shenu, V'ayin, Le'ish. If it's a Tzon Barzel slave, he gets to go free if the husband knocks out his tooth or pokes him in the eye. So therefore, there's out of an incidence of ownership by the husband, it's as if it's his. Avalo leisha. But even though she gets it back if there's a divorce and she still has title, if she pokes out that stone Barzel slave's eye, the slave does not go free. So we see that the incidence of ownership shifts to the husband in that case. And therefore, since the husband has the incidence of ownership, just giving the money, which is what Rav Ami said, would be good enough. Tanya Kavasi to Reb Yehuda, but we have a brisa like Reb Yehuda. HaMekneses shum labayla. A woman evaluates a piece of property and brings it to the marriage, and it becomes part of the kasuba. Im ratza haba l'mocher lo yimchar. If the husband chooses to sell it, he does not have the right to do so. It's got an encumbrance on it, her ownership. Not only that, ella afilo hichnes lo shum mishaloi. But even if in that kasuba, he says, I'll give you my apartment in Fort Lauderdale as a guarantee of your kasuba. So he encumbers his own property. Imratza habal imkar, if he chooses to sell it, lo yimkar, he cannot sell it without her permission. She has a mortgage on it. So we see both sides. It doesn't really prove anything. On the one hand, he can't sell it because it's sort of hers. On the other hand, if it really is his, as long as it's encumbered, he can't sell it. So Machro Shnehem Uparnasa, what if he does, even though he's not supposed to? What if he does sell encumbered property, whether it's his or hers, because they need the money? A real case like that came to Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. He said, Habal Maitze Miyad Halakochos. The husband has to go to court and reclaim the property from the purchasers and give them back their money. The sale cannot be final if it's encumbered property. So therefore, he has to get the property back and he has to give it to his wife. So that is a support to Reb Yehuda that money's not good enough. He has to return the actual object. Omer Rava, Omer Reb Nachman, halacha Reb Yehuda. They say the halacha is like Reb Yehuda. She gets back the dishes. Omer le Rava le Reb Nachman. V'hasanya, but we have a price the other way around. Kavasi the Rav Ami. We have a price that supports Rav Ami. All she gets is the value of the dishes at the time they married. Afal gav the Sanya Kavasi the Rav Ami. Mistavra, time of the Rav Yehuda makes more sense to hold like Rav Yehuda. Mishum Shevach Beis Aviha, because of the unquantifiable value of possessions that came in the family, and the satisfying with money won't do it. You got to get the object back. So that seems at this moment to be the halacha. We're going to see it ain't necessarily so. Hahi itza. There was a lady. The Ayla Leila Gavra Itztala de Melsa the Kesuvasa. A woman purchased and listed in her Kesuba a Vikunya coat, a very expensive garment for her husband to wear. But it's listed in the Kesuba as Son Barzel. If we get divorced, I get it back. I want my husband to wear the coat, not my ex-husband. Shachib, the husband drops dead. Now, at this moment in time, the coat is encumbered by the ksuba. She has a lien on the coat, but the coat is in the husband's possession, and possession is 9/10 of the law. So the kids are very smart. The kids say, we'll take this expensive coat and we'll use it as tachrichin, and we'll save the expense of going and buying tachrichin. So what they do, what they do is shakluha yasme uparsuha amisahna. They take the coat and they wrap it around Tati's dead body. So now the woman goes to Bezdin and she says, I want my coat back. And the children go to the same Bezdin and they say, excuse me, but as soon as we wrap Tati with it, it's Asir Bahana. So you can't have it back. It's Tati's. He gets taken to the grave with him. So the question is, whose claim is valid? Now, ostensibly, her claim is valid. They stole her coat from her. But possession is 9/10 of the law. She had not, what?
These 9/10 of the law discusses possessions. It doesn't mean that if you have possession, you have
But what is this case? This case is it's in his possession. She has a claim. So what we have to decide is a claim inviolate? I have a mortgage on your apartment. I get to get my mortgage paid off no matter what. Or if you can figure out a legal way to sell your apartment less my mortgage, without regard to my mortgage, tough noogies. I have a mortgage on an apartment that's not yours anymore. It's invalid. It has no value. If there is a legal loophole that they can wiggle out, then possession is 9/10 of the law. That's the case. Amarava Kenya Misna. The dead body acquired the garment. It's now Asir Bahano. Her claim is invalid. And he explains it like this. Amalei Nanane Berei the Rav Yosef Berei the Rava Rav Kahana. He says over to Rav Kahana, Va Omer Rava Omer Rav Nachman Halacha Rav Yehuda. But didn't you tell me that we always paskin like Rav Yehuda? She should get the coat back. So Omer Lei Mi Loi Moide Rav Yehuda de Mechusar Guvaina. Doesn't Rav Yehuda acknowledge that in cases where the lien holder did not move to repossess, that the garment is still in the possession of the holder. Kevan the mechuser guvanya, since she has not taken legal action to repossess the coat, and berishusei koi, it's still in the husband, the estate's possession. They can therefore act to make it have no value, to put it on the body, and it's aser bahana.
There's something wrong here.
Yeah, there's a lot wrong with it.
Okay,
Let me
go ahead, talk it through.
I mean, wait a second. It says in the ksuba that gave you this coat here and so forth. I've never and shown it. Whatever happens, it's got to come back to me.
Correct.
Now he dies. Doesn't the Trumpers have to go through the whole
Yes,
ksuba?
absolutely.
And he sees this.
Absolutely. But he didn't do that yet. But he didn't do that yet. And the children took an action that made the coat aser bahana. In no case is she going to really get the coat back. The question is, will they have to pay for it?
You're saying that it's not her fault. She could have been in Europe.
I understand, but now, so what you want, what you're really asking me, if I can rephrase the question, how can a person act when there is a lien on the object?
How can they do anything
when it's encumbered by the kasuba? It's encumbered by the kasuba. So if I can find halachic cases where the possessor may act with encumbered property and the act is chol, if I can show you proof that can happen, that would support the children's behavior. So a Gemara will tell you this. Rava the time, Rava rationalizes because of his own opinion. The Omer Rava, hekdesh and chometz. If I owe Marty money, and I say to Marty, I'll take these 3 sheep, and I'll give you a lien on these 3 sheep. If I don't pay you, you have the right to come and get these 3 sheep. Now, there's a lien on those sheep. What if it's Pesach time, and I need to shech the shepsel to make my korban Pesach? I take one of those sheep, and I shecht it, and I make that my korban Pesach, and Marty comes screaming, but I had a lien on that sheep. Tough noogies. I'm allowed to give it to Hekdesh, and it's chol. Chometz.
The magic word, I can give it to Hegdesh.
Okay, next case. Chometz. Chometz. I have a barn full of wheat. I borrow money from O'Reilly, the banker. I put a mortgage on the wheat in my barn. Now Pesach comes. I burn the barn because I have to destroy my chometz. O'Reilly comes and takes me to Din Torah and says, you destroyed my wheat. I had a lien on it. It doesn't cancel the loan, but I had the right to destroy the wheat because I didn't want to be over chometz alav Pesach. Okay? And shecharur. If I have a slave and I have a lien on the slave. I bought the slave from Marty. I only gave him $50 down. I still owe $950 on the slave, and I free the slave. Marty has no taina because I'm allowed to free a slave. So we have here 3 cases. Memafkirin midei hashivut, where my action I can act legally with an encumbered property, and the transaction is valid. It does not cancel my obligation. The state still has to pay the value of the coat as stipulated in the kasuba, but she cannot rip the coat off the dead body and give it to her next husband. And we'll stop there.
Can she also claim value for herself of the family, even though
Hmm?
maybe I'm not phrasing it properly.
I mean, can she get intangible value? No, Besden doesn't recognize intangible value.
Michael, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. To whom am I speaking? I only see me. Who am I?
Now, I see me.
Oh, there you are. Okay. I hope that was clear. I try to be as clear as I can. Be well.
All right, be good.
See you
Good,
tomorrow. And I'm glad we could hook up with you.
good. Thanks, Bob.